Hello, my name is Holger Schünemann. Welcome to the introductory course to WHO guidelines and GRADE. This is Module 5, Guideline Adaptation and an Overview of GRADE Adolopment. It's Module 5 out of 6 modules that are narrated based on slides, contain separate quizzes, and you can go at your own pace by stopping the recording at any time and restarting it. Before I start, here are my disclosures. The World Health Organization funded this training module and the other modules in the course. The views that I express here are my own. As I said, Module 5 deals with guideline adaptation and the overview of GRADE Adolopment. The topics that I will cover include why we adapt guidelines and what guideline adaptation and adoption really is, specifically focusing on the GRADE Adolopment framework, which stands for adoption, adaptation, and de novo creation of recommendations within a guideline. I will briefly mention other approaches as well. So what is the problem? Guideline development can be human and resource intensive. That's why we often use existing guidelines and evidence syntheses to facilitate the work of developing guidelines. The intention of adaptational health guidelines is to improve efficiency, increase uptake by involving the relevant stakeholders, for instance, in contextualization at a country level, and avoidance of duplication. Adaptation is described in the WHO handbook as the following. Adaptation of WHO guidelines, taking into account local circumstances and resource considerations, can be done at the regional, national, or subnational level. Translation is one element in the adaptation process. Personally, I always say, no implementation without adaptation. The manual and toolkit for guideline adaptation published by the Guidelines International Network describes some of the approaches. As I said, we will focus on a newer approach, the GRADE Adolopment approach. About 15 years back from the time of the narration of this presentation, we asked the following questions to determine if adaptation of a guideline is actually required. So for instance, is there important variation in need, such as prevalence, baseline risk, or health status, that might lead to different decisions? Or if there's important variation in the availability of resources that might lead to different decisions, or is there important variation in cost that might lead to different decisions, important variation and factors that could modify the expected effects, for instance, resistance patterns of microbiological pathogens, and if there is important variation in the relative value of the main benefits and downsides that might lead to different decisions in order to decide whether or not a guideline should be adapted. And to conceptualize this, the methods to increase efficiency in guideline development, as I already briefly described, include adoption of a recommendation which uses an already developed recommendation basically as they is or are, with information on how to implement them. Adaptation of a recommendation means that an adapted recommendation has been developed elsewhere and then contextualized to fit the needs of the place where they're implemented or the setting that they're implemented. De novo recommendations depend typically on some degree of completely de novo synthesis and new recommendations. It is in the absence of a benchmark guideline when evidence synthesis is available, but a source recommendation is not available. Ideally, one would combine these choices in a guideline that contains many recommendations. So the most important basis for updating a recommendation is the existence of a trustworthy systematic review that can then be used for the judgments by the particular guideline panel in the adaptation process. The efficiency has also been greatly helped then by the GRADE evidence to decision frameworks that can be completed online, and therefore the term adolopment following the great evidence to decision framework that help with adoption, adaptation, and de novo development of trustworthy recommendations. There are a few fundamental factors that are required in order to appropriately adopt or adapt a recommendation. The first is an evidence synthesis, ideally presented as a summary of findings table or evidence profile. Then the rationale for why a source guideline that contains many recommendations can be adapted to local or national circumstances or adopted is the availability of the transparent rationale for how the source recommendation and the relevant guideline development group went from the evidence to the recommendation or decision. And obviously, in order to decide whether or not to adopt or adapt a recommendation, one would need a recommendation. I mentioned the special case. If there are gaps in the source guideline, one might develop a new recommendation. And the fundamental underlying principle for appropriate adaptation and adoption are really the availability of these factors that determine the direction and strength. The evidence to decision or evidence to recommendation frameworks by the GREAT Working Group facilitate that work and are fundamental for the approach that I'm presenting here. As a brief recall, there are criteria such as the benefits and harms of the option, the value and the balance of the benefits, required resources, cost effectiveness, equity, acceptability, feasibility that contain factors such as legal frameworks, ethics, human rights, are the criteria that determine the direction and strength of a recommendation. They should be informed by research evidence in the source guideline or an explicit statement that research evidence was either not looked for or it was considered only selectively. And then any additional considerations that a panel may make and the judgments related to that. And the GREAT Pro GDT guideline development tool facilitates that work in an online mode and with technical support tools. Now, when that is available and a process for trustworthy guideline recommendations has been followed, so for instance, that can be evaluated with the AGREE instrument or other instruments that help assess a guideline for trustworthiness, that's the case, then evidence sharing, updating, and collaborations on the basis of the evidence to decision frameworks as a central piece may be possible, both on a regional level or internationally on a country level. And this is where adaptation and adoption and development then comes in. A source guideline can be utilized in a specific setting to develop recommendations that are contextualized for the new setting. And that information can again be shared. Guideline adaptation requires planning. That includes identifying groups in the setting where one wants to implement and appropriate role assignment and budgeting of these groups, prioritization of guideline topics, prioritization of the questions for the guidelines, updating systematic reviews or evidence or knowledge syntheses, and identifying local data, then preparing or updating these great tables that we described. It requires training the guideline panelists and then formulating and rating the strength of recommendations, including then collection of feedback. I will explain these steps in more detail in this introductory module. The process is as follows. It begins with the selection of a guideline topic and prioritization of questions with local or, for instance, national groups. That means that identified credible guidelines or evidence syntheses helps before priorities are set by a guideline group on a national or local level that involves the relevant stakeholders. Guideline questions should be prioritized using standard methods to address local needs and priorities. From these possible candidate guidelines, an appropriate source guideline should be identified, for instance, by making sure that it is relevant, that it is of good enough quality. So for instance, with an evaluation using the AGREE tool, that it is relatively recent and ideally use the grade approach. The next step is to match possible source guideline recommendations to the prioritized questions that are relevant for the stakeholders where one adapts. The next step is to then say, are there matching recommendations? If they exist, one identifies whether or not existing systematic reviews that should have been utilized in a credible guideline require updating. So for instance, they may be outdated or they may not be complete. For instance, they did not include all relevant outcomes. Further, one evaluates if the source guideline actually has completed an evidence to decision framework, either the grade evidence to decision framework or another framework that allows for understanding the rationale of going from evidence to a recommendation. If not, one needs to develop a new evidence to decision framework using, for instance, the ETD evidence to decision frameworks in the available tools. If ETDs are available, the judgment should be reviewed. The judgments in the source guidelines should be reviewed, and one should determine if one agrees with them or not, and indicate any reasons for disagreement. For instance, if there is new evidence. Following that, an Adolopment recommendation is developed based on the ETD judgments. Is the recommendation going to be similar to the source recommendation? Is the first question, which leads to an adopted recommendation. In other words, if the recommendation in the new guideline is the same as in the source recommendation or guideline. If the recommendation has been changed to fit the context, for instance, to a judgment on the ETD that is different or a population that was adjusted, we're talking about an adapted recommendation. And as mentioned above, under 14, if a matching recommendation does not exist, one goes down the pathway of developing a new recommendation, which will require the identification of new evidence. So in other words, what that means for a guideline is that a recommendation may be utilized as is, that's called adoption. It may be utilized with changes to it, which means adaptation, or it may be based on new evidence reviews, which means that a new recommendation is formulated. To remind you, this is critically dependent on the availability of evidence to decision frameworks or information that allows to provide new evidence to decision frameworks that help a local or national or the adapting guideline panel with the Adolopment process. That should include an appraisal of what the source guideline development group has done and a checking of the judgments that have been utilized. So for instance, here an example around breast cancer screening, the source guideline might have described the incidence of breast cancer in a particular setting. The guideline that actually adapts or the developing group should describe or should identify if that type of problem is similar in magnitude. For instance, the incidence in the setting where the guideline will be utilized is similar or not. And that can be edited, for instance, here in the grade for Adolopment module. At the end of the day, going through all of the criteria in the evidence to decision framework as the developing guideline development group will determine if one agrees with the original judgments on the ETD criteria based on the evidence that is out there or not. So for instance, here highlighted in yellow would be different judgments of the Adolopment Guideline Development Group. If they differ, one should provide a rationale, ideally based on the contextual evidence or new evidence that might have arisen. And this will lead to recommendations that might either be the same or differ. So for instance, the source guideline might have offered a conditional recommendation in favor. The Adolopment guideline might have, for a specific question, offered a conditional recommendation against. For instance, based on higher resource requirements, different resource requirements, different cost effectiveness thresholds, or differences in, for instance, the prevalence or incidence of a disease. And that means that a recommendation that previously was in favor could become a recommendation against, or a conditional recommendation that was offered globally could become a strong recommendation in a specific setting if, for instance, resources were available but were of concern in the original source guideline. So that leads then typically to an adult recommendation, like in this hypothetical scenario where a conditional recommendation for breast cancer screening in 40 to 49-year-old women was altered or adapted to become a conditional recommendation against mammography screening because of lower incidence of the disease. So what does it take to develop guidelines? We talked about the Grade Pro Adolopment module that can be utilized in this electronic format, ideally based on shared information. And there are tools, such as that tool that I just described, that allows you to turn on a number of features as the guideline developer in order to use the source information and transparently show what information actually changes. We look at Adolopment just as an overview. As I mentioned, recommendations within a guideline will either be adopted, adapted, or de novo created to form a sensible guideline. For instance, breast cancer screening for all ages, all source recommendations should be looked at, diagnostic strategies may be looked at, and each individual recommendation will either then be adopted or adapted or de novo created if there are gaps in the source guidelines. And with regards to what is required, an adopted recommendation is the least financially intense approach to making a recommendation. Adaptation typically means that one has updated a systematic review. De novo creation means that there's a gap and one needs to spend more resources on developing that recommendation. Typically, in adoption, it means that local values are not as important for adaptation. Values, for instance, or resources may have played a big role. Same for de novo recommendation. With regards to time to completion, you see here that adoption requires the least time. Typically, adaptation requires somewhat more time because it requires more conversation, local evidence identification. De novo creation, obviously, requires most time to complete. And with regards to the availability of existing guidelines and their impact on what method can be used, you see here that de novo creation obviously is least affected by it. It's more affected by existing evidence syntheses, as also described here. Then with regards to whether or not the original question was modified, that typically does not happen in the adoption approach. It may happen in adaptation. It typically is a new PICO question for de novo creation of recommendations. Now, there are different approaches than the Great Adolopment approach. A systematic review conducted in 2017 of the various methods that are available identified Great Adolopment as the methods of choice when one knows why a recommendation has been made by the original source guideline group. Indeed, if that's not the case, there is no sense to adapt it. These are the approaches that have been reviewed in this particular article and viewers, listeners are referred to that article mentioned above. So in summary, we described why one would adapt a guideline, in particular because that increases efficiency while involving the relevant stakeholders, including those who implement it. For instance, a professional group that works in a particular setting. And we describe what guideline adaptation and adoption is, focusing on the Great Adolopment approach, which is one of several approaches. However, it describes and operationalizes the process of adoption and adaptation and de novo creation of guidelines for contextualized or using contextualized information in a clear and transparent way. Next, I will go through the quiz questions. So try to answer the question before I continue to the next slide. Which of the following is not part of Great Adolopment? Adaptation, adoption, rejection, or de novo development? Rejection. Rejection of guidelines or recommendations is not part of the Adolopment process. Question 2. Great Adolopment is used to standardize care globally. Is that true or false? This is false. Adolopment is an efficient way to reduce resources and time required to develop a guideline that fits the relevant context, for instance, that of a country, by considering context-specific, for instance, values, cost, feasibility, etc. Question 3. What are the most important requirements for transparent and sound adaptation of a recommendation? A recent systematic review, a very recent guideline recommendation, understanding the criteria and judgments used to make a recommendation. The most important aspect for adaptation and adoption of the recommendation is understanding the criteria and judgments used to make that recommendation in the source guideline. Adaptation is not sensible if the rationale for a recommendation cannot be understood. Question 4. Adolopment refers to adapting a single recommendation. True or false? False. Adolopment typically refers to adapting, adopting, or de novo creation based on an existing guideline and existing evidence syntheses in a new guideline that is relevant for the context. Thank you very much, and we will see you in a different module of this course or another course.